What happens when a top journalist tries to corner Vice President JD Vance on live TV, but ends up losing control instead? This wasn't just an interview, it was a reckoning, a moment that sent shockwaves across the country, exposing something far bigger than politics. Was this about policy, or about who controls the truth? Stay tuned, because this is a story you don't want to miss. The studio buzzed with the energy of a high-stakes political showdown. The cameras were set, the lighting was flawless, and behind the glass, producers whispered into their headsets, double-checking every angle. This wasn't just another interview. This was must-watch television. Vice President JD Vance had arrived for what was billed as a deep dive into the administration's latest economic and foreign policy moves. But anyone paying attention knew better. This was never going to be just about policy. Sitting across from him was Daniel Riker, a veteran political journalist known for his relentless questioning and sharp-edged skepticism. He had built his career on dissecting conservative leaders, pushing them into uncomfortable corners and leaving them scrambling for solid ground. And tonight, with millions watching, he had his sights locked on Vance. Vance, clad in a crisp navy suit, settled into his chair with a measured calm. He had been in countless interviews before, but this one felt different. He could see it in Riker's eyes, the eagerness, the expectation that this would be another moment where the media dictated the narrative. But Vance wasn't here to play by their rules. The countdown clock ticked to 0, the red light blinked on. "Mr. Vice President, thank you for being here," Riker began, his voice smooth, calculated. Vance nodded. "Appreciate the invitation." The opening civility was a formality. The real battle was about to begin. Daniel Riker wasted no time. He leaned in slightly, his eyes locked on JD Vance, his voice smooth but pointed. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. He was here to corner the Vice President. "Mr. Vice President, let's get straight to it," Riker began. "Your administration has been accused of fueling division, prioritizing loyalty over governance, and undermining democratic institutions. Isn't it fair to say that you're not leading the country? You're leading a movement that thrives on conflict." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The studio audience tensed, some shifting in their seats. Even in the control room, producers exchanged glances. This wasn't a question, it was a trap. JD Vance didn't blink. He had walked into this interview knowing exactly what was coming. He adjusted slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. Calm, measured, but firm. "Daniel, let me ask you something," he said. "If standing up for the millions of Americans who feel ignored, disrespected, and cast aside is what you call fueling division, then what exactly do you call what you're doing right now?" A flicker of something crossed Riker's face. Surprise, annoyance, whatever it was, it disappeared in an instant. He let out a short, controlled exhale and gave a tight-lipped smile. "You're deflecting, Mr. Vice President," he countered. "The fact is, many former officials, even members of your own party, have said your administration puts loyalty to Donald Trump above loyalty to the Constitution. How do you respond to that?" A beat of silence. Not the empty kind, but the charged, electric kind. The kind that pulls people to the edges of their seats. Vance's jaw tensed slightly. Then he leaned forward, voice steady, controlled. "I respond by asking, who gets to decide what's dangerous?" he said. "You? The media? The same institutions that told us for years that outsourcing our jobs was good for the economy? The same people who ignored a border crisis until it became politically inconvenient? The same experts who dragged us into endless wars and told us they were making the world safer?" The audience stirred, some nodding, others murmuring. The shift in energy was unmistakable. Riker held his ground, but the tightness in his grip on his notes was telling. "You're very good at turning things around," he said, voice still steady. "But let's be honest, Trump's supporters, your supporters, have shown a level of unwavering loyalty that some might call irrational." The second the words left his mouth, the atmosphere changed. A faint gasp rippled through the audience. The tension snapped into something sharper, heavier. Even the control room went still. JD Vance's fingers curled slightly against the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but razor sharp. "That's a disgraceful thing to say." Riker blinked. "How so?" Vance's stare was unflinching. "Because you're not just attacking me," he said. "You're insulting millions of hardworking Americans. People who've spent years watching politicians talk down to them while their towns collapsed, their jobs disappeared, and the institutions that were supposed to serve them called them backwards for having different values." A few claps scattered through the audience, small but growing. Riker's smile thinned. "Mr. Vice President, let's not be dramatic. I'm simply pointing out that some might see their unwavering loyalty as irrational." Vance shook his head, exhaling sharply. "And there it is," he said. "You don't debate policy. You don't ask real questions. You mock. You dismiss. You act like anyone who disagrees with you is either stupid or dangerous." This time the audience reacted. Claps, murmurs, even those who had come expecting a different outcome were watching differently now. Riker raised a hand, trying to regain control. "All right, let's—" "No," Vance interrupted, his voice rising just a notch. "Let's stay on this. Because this is exactly why Americans don't trust the media anymore. You sit in this studio treating half the country like they're a problem to be solved instead of people with real concerns." And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. Riker glanced at his notes, flipping through them as if searching for something to regain control, but there was no way out. Because this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. The second JD Vance finished speaking, the energy in the studio shifted. Not just a minor reaction, this was something bigger. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore, they were witnessing a moment. A moment that felt different. A moment that wasn't supposed to happen. Daniel Riker, usually in full control of his interviews, had lost his grip on the narrative. He tried to press forward, to regain his footing, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The controlled environment of primetime television was slipping through his fingers, and outside the studio, the real storm was already brewing. In the control room, producers stared at their monitors in stunned silence. They knew what they had just captured. They had seen viral moments before. Clashes, heated exchanges, controversial sound bites. But this was different. This wasn't just another argument on cable news. This was a reckoning in real time, and the world was about to see it. Within minutes, the first clips hit social media. Twitter exploded. Conservative commentators seized the moment, cutting up the footage into bite-sized videos and posting them with captions like, "JD Vance just exposed the media live on air. This is why Americans don't trust the press anymore. Watch Riker squirm when Vance calls him out." Priceless. The clips spread like wildfire. They flooded Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, racking up millions of views in a matter of hours. Memes surfaced almost instantly. One showed Vance's stoic face photoshopped onto a warrior with the caption, "The man who didn't flinch." Even neutral observers, those who didn't necessarily support Trump or Vance, couldn't ignore what had just happened. Say what you want about JD Vance, but he just stood his ground in a way most politicians never do. "I don't like Trump, but the media bias is undeniable." This interview just proved it. This wasn't just a debate, this was a political moment. Riker's defenders scrambled to do damage control. Progressive pundits went on air insisting that Vance had dodged real questions, that he had used deflection and rhetoric to avoid accountability. They called him dangerous, calculated, a demagogue in the making. But no matter how they framed it, the narrative had already spun out of their control. And the numbers didn't lie. By the end of the night, the interview was the one trending topic on Twitter, with millions of posts dissecting, analyzing, and debating every second of the exchange. The official YouTube clip uploaded by the network was flooded with comments. So many that moderators couldn't keep up. Some were brutal. "Riker got destroyed. This is why nobody trusts these people anymore. This wasn't journalism, this was an ambush." And JD Vance flipped the script. The media hates it when they can't control the conversation. Even more telling, Some comments came from people who had never supported Trump or Vance, but found themselves agreeing with his argument. No fan of Trump, but Vance made a good point. The media doesn't treat both sides equally. You don't have to like JD Vance to realize he was 100% right in this moment. It wasn't just about the interview anymore. It was about something much bigger. Inside the network's headquarters, panic was setting in. Executives huddled in emergency meetings, staring at real-time analytics that told them exactly what they didn't want to see. The clip wasn't dying down, it was gaining more traction by the minute. Sponsors were already making calls. Some weren't pulling their ads, not yet, but they were asking questions. What's your plan for handling this? How bad is the backlash? Are we looking at a credibility problem? It was a PR nightmare. And in the middle of it all, Daniel Riker had gone silent. No tweets, no statements, nothing. The man who had spent years controlling conversations was now the one being talked about, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. Meanwhile, JD Vance wasn't backing down. Instead of letting the moment fade, he capitalized on it. Within 24 hours, he had done interviews on multiple conservative talk shows, discussing the moment in his own words. He wasn't letting the media spin it. If the press is so convinced they're neutral, he said during one segment, why do they panic every time someone calls them out? The host nodded. They don't like it when the roles are reversed. Exactly, Vance replied. And I'm not the only one who sees it. That's why this moment resonated so much. It's bigger than me. People are tired of being told they're the problem just for thinking differently. His words landed, and as the internet continued to dissect, debate, and explode over the interview, one thing became undeniably clear. This wasn't going away. Inside the network's headquarters, the tension was suffocating. Executives sat around a long glass conference table, their eyes glued to massive screens displaying real-time engagement data. The numbers were a nightmare. The JD Vance interview wasn't just a bad segment, it had become a phenomenon. It was trending on every major platform, dominating the news cycle and reshaping the conversation in ways they hadn't anticipated. The worst part? They had lost control of the narrative. Daniel Riker, their top anchor, had gone from veteran journalist to the man who got exposed on live television. The clip was everywhere, and no amount of spin was working. Every attempt to shift the focus, whether by framing Vance as evasive or calling his arguments populist deflections, only seemed to fuel the fire. We need a response, one executive finally said, breaking the silence. Heads nodded, but the question wasn't if they needed a response, it was what kind of response wouldn't make things worse. They couldn't outright attack JD Vance, that would only escalate the backlash. But they also couldn't ignore it, not when advertisers were already making nervous phone calls. We issue a statement, someone suggested, something neutral, acknowledge the intensity of the debate without admitting fault. It was the standard playbook, a safe, calculated move that might take the edge off the outrage, at least for the corporate sponsors. By midday, the official statement was drafted and released. Last night's interview between Vice President JD Vance and Daniel Riker sparked an important and at times heated discussion. While we stand by our commitment to journalistic integrity, we acknowledge that some viewers may have felt that portions of the conversation were not conducted with the balance and neutrality expected of our platform. We remain dedicated to fostering open and respectful dialogue across political perspectives. It was a non-apology, carefully worded, designed to acknowledge the backlash without actually admitting they had done anything wrong. But it didn't work. The comment section was brutal. So you admit it was biased, but you're not actually sorry? This is damage control, not accountability. Just say you weren't expecting Vance to fight back and move on. Even mainstream journalists outside the network weren't buying it. The statement was too vague, too corporate, too obviously an attempt to move past the controversy without addressing it directly. And then there was Daniel Riker. He had been silent since the interview. No tweets, no statements, just radio silence. That wasn't like him. Riker was known for his fiery post-interview analysis, his ability to frame any moment in his favor. But now, he was the story. And the network knew he couldn't stay quiet forever. The pressure mounted. Executives made it clear Riker had to say something. The damage was too big, the backlash too intense. The sponsors wanted reassurance. The network's credibility, at least among its target audience, was on shaky ground. Finally, Riker agreed to go on air, but he wasn't happy about it. He sat stiffly in his usual chair, the familiar studio lights shining down on him. But tonight, he wasn't the one controlling the conversation. He was the subject of it. The teleprompter rolled. His voice was measured, carefully scripted. As many of you know, last night's interview with Vice President JD Vance sparked intense debate. I want to take a moment to reflect on that conversation and acknowledge the strong reactions it has caused. He took a breath. He hated this. It is never my intention to alienate viewers or disrespect anyone's political beliefs. I regret that some felt that my words were dismissive or unfair. I stand by my commitment to tough but fair journalism, and I will continue to ask the hard questions. It wasn't an apology. It was damage control, repackaged as reflection. It was a line thrown to the network's executives, something they could point to and say, "See, we addressed it." But outside the studio, no one was buying it. The second Riker's statement aired, the internet tore it apart. Conservative commentators mocked it as the fakest apology in television history. Twitter exploded with brutal side-by-side comparisons, clips of Riker scoffing at JD Vance next to his forced, stiff-faced apology. Translation: "I'm sorry you noticed my bias." This isn't accountability, this is just spin. They're only acknowledging it because they got caught. Even some liberals admitted the damage was done. Look, I don't support Vance, but this was a terrible response. It just made Riker look weak. The story refused to die. Instead of closing the controversy, Riker's statement only fueled it further. And as for JD Vance, he wasn't letting up. Within hours, he was back on conservative media, doubling down on his original argument. If the media is so convinced they're neutral, why do they always panic when someone calls them out? The clip went viral instantly, and with every interview, every response, Vance was winning the post-debate battle. Riker had been forced to address the controversy. The network had been dragged into damage control mode. But nothing they did could change the simple truth. JD Vance had turned their own stage against them, and no amount of PR spin was going to undo that. Days passed, but the fire from that interview refused to burn out. The moment had transcended the usual political noise. This wasn't just about JD Vance or Daniel Riker anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about trust, about power, about who controls the narrative. Major news outlets scrambled to put their spin on it. Some dismissed it as just another political clash. Others framed it as proof of the growing divide in American discourse. But no matter how they spun it, they all had to acknowledge one thing. This moment had hit a nerve. Riker, once seen as an unshakable voice in political journalism, now carried a stain that wouldn't wash off. He wasn't just another host anymore. He was the guy who lost control of his own show. Inside the network, executives were uneasy. Their usual approach, waiting for controversy to pass, wasn't working. The more they tried to steer focus elsewhere, the more people kept bringing it back. Some advertisers quietly distanced themselves, pausing campaigns, reevaluating partnerships. The network wasn't in crisis yet, but the warning signs were flashing. Meanwhile, JD Vance was thriving. His following had exploded, his voice was louder than ever. He wasn't just the vice president anymore, he was the man who stood his ground against the media machine. But here's the thing, this moment was never really about JD Vance. It was about something much bigger. People saw themselves in that moment. Conservatives saw a man who refused to be talked down to, who stood up to a media establishment that so often dismissed them. Independents and moderates, even those who didn't particularly support Trump, found themselves nodding along to Vance's argument. Because they, too, had started questioning whether the media was really playing fair. Even some liberals, tired of the relentless groupthink in mainstream narratives, admitted that Riker had crossed a line. It wasn't just a TV moment, it was a cultural flashpoint. And that's why it wouldn't go away. Because no matter where you stood politically, it forced a question: do we actually want honest conversations, or just ones that fit a certain script? That question kept replaying in people's minds, long after the cameras stopped rolling. So now it's your turn. Do you believe political debates are fair? Do you think the media treats all voices equally? Or do moments like this prove that some opinions are always meant to be dismissed? Let me know in the comments. Let's have the conversation. And if you want more stories that cut through the noise, don't forget to subscribe, because in a world where narratives are shaped before the truth even comes out, you need to hear the full story.